Welcome to an episode of Behind the Scenes, a weekly program unveiling the biggest political developments in Somali politics and the wider Horn of Africa region. I'm Sultan Mohammed, your host and co-producer here on Horford Media alongside Suleiman Hashi. On this week's program, the impasse in Gedo seems to spiral out of control as FEET announces to hold elections in El Waq instead of Gerbahare. The regional authority in Gedo, some political analysts and commentators have rejected such a proposition, citing illegal and political limitations to do so. As the Gedo governor Bule announces elections in Gerbahare and Jubaland State Election Implementation Team set out a roadmap for El Waq, what does this mean for elections in Somalia? Also on the program, the Supreme Court of Somalia listens to Fahad Dahir Yassin versus the Federal Election Implementation Team case this morning, as Mr. Yassin argues that his seat was legally won through the correct procedures outlined under the 17 September agreement, a position rejected by FEET, instead demanding a re-election of seat HOP 086. Now, these are the topics on the program today. We hope you find this program very informative. Please like, share, and for similar content, do subscribe to Horford Media. Also, do subscribe to Horford Media Group's second channel known as Horford TV, where you can find exclusive programs such as Mahahi Saleh, among others. And last but not least, do follow myself, Sultan Mohammed, Suleiman Hashi, Yassin Abdi, and the wider Horford Media team and our social media platforms that should appear on the screen any moment. Before we begin the program today, I'd like to send my deepest condolences to the family, friends and supporters of the late Abwan Badal, who was shot and killed as he left a masjid in Mogadishu following Maghrib prayers. All our prayers here for the media are with the late Abwan and his family and friends. Let's get straight to the news. Following continuous deadlock and impasse regarding the seats in Gedo between authorities in Kismayo and Gerbahare, the Jubaland Vice President Mahmoud Aden announced that the elections will not be able to happen in Gerbahare, citing the administration that currently governs Gedo was not founded on the correct procedure stipulated under both federal and Jubaland state laws. In a statement, the Vice President of Jubaland continued that the resolution to the deadlock would require more than the timeline outlined to hold the elections. This comes at a time when the Jubaland President Ahmed Mohamed Islam Madobe travelled to Nairobi to meet senior Kenyan government and military officials, as well as other members of the international community, to discuss a new venue to hold the election. Now, bearing in mind this happened about 2 weeks ago, it is an important point in this decision. An understanding would eventually be reached between the officials and Madobe for the venue to be El Waq, and on this agreement, the location of the election would be just outside El Waq airport, and security would be provided by the Kenyan Defence Forces supported by Jubaland state soldiers in the region. Now, Ahmed Islam Madobe and his administration have continuously argued that the Gedo region had a heavy presence of Somali federal troops, that Madobe saw as a direct threat to the monopolized control he seeks of the election in Gedo. Various Jubaland state ministers have gone on the record on social media to claim that the president of Somalia, Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo, was using troops in Gedo to influence the election in the region and inhibit the Jubaland authorities from exercising authority in Gedo. Now, Jubaland forces currently control only one area within the Gedo region. Additionally, some have argued that due to the security situation in Gerbahare, it is very difficult to hold elections there. However, the problem with such an argument is that there's too many holes. For example, there has been no bomb and security threat in the town this year. And secondly, the situation in Dhacdooyinka that we have seen in Bosaso and even in Mogadishu itself were much more dire and are currently much more dire than Gerbahare. Yet elections happen there, and therefore the argument that security is terrible in Gerbahare is a flawed one. Furthermore, many analysts have cited that the presence of Somali troops is not illegal or wrong per se. Somali troops are within the borders of Somalia and therefore have every right to be in Gedo constitutionally speaking, especially if the people in the region, including the authorities in Gerbahare, support this measure. Additionally, we have to look back to December 2020 to understand why Somali troops are in Gedo. In 2020, Kenyan government helped organize a militia led by Janan, the then security minister in Jubaland, that would attack Somali forces in Beled Hawa, only to be swiftly defeated. Now, the continued risk in the region from both foreign and Al-Shabaab troops warrant the presence of Somali forces according to the Somali federal government, and this is to protect the region, and this decision was firmly supported by the people in the region. Now, the question to ask is, firstly, Is Ahmed Madobe correct in accusing President Farmaajo of directly meddling in the Gedo region? Now, President Ahmed Madobe has had issues with Gedo region for a decade now, ever since he was appointed president of Jubaland, controversially, by many accused the Kenyan government in 2011 following the KDF invasion. Now, Gedo was a region that continuously rejected the authority and legitimacy of President Madobe due to the fact that the region did not elect him directly. The Farmaajo administration isn't the first administration that has had issues with Madobe's state government in Kismayo over Gedo. A similar accusation, Madobe administration, was also thrown against Hassan Sheikh Mahmoud when he was president, as well as Sharif Sheikh Ahmed during his presidency. And therefore, the issue of Gedo and Jubaland predates the election impasse in 2022. In fact, the election revealed the severity of the deteriorating relationship between Gedo and Kismayo, and blaming President Farmaajo and every other president that comes to the federal government can be seen as an attempt to simplify a very complex problem in Jubaland as it struggles to establish itself as an effective federal member state. Despite being in power for nearly 11 years, Madobe has failed to unite the entirety of Jubaland under one administration. Large parts of the state is currently controlled by Al-Shabaab, for example, the Lower Juba, whereas Gedo remains at a tight loggerhead with his administration in Kismayo. And even Kismayo itself remains the transitional capital, as the actual capital is currently controlled by Al-Shabaab, and therefore the Jubaland state is struggling to effectively expand, and it has been for a decade. Therefore, for Jubaland to overcome the current impasse, it must reassess its own structure and democratic governance by firstly dealing with the issues raised by the people of Gedo rather than bypassing it, and secondly allowing more federal troops, including Gorgor units, into the region to provide more support for Jubaland state forces that are currently fighting Al-Shabaab. It is clear that the Kenyan Defense Forces have failed to eradicate the militants, despite a decade-long presence in Jubaland. Now, the second question one might be asking himself is, can elections actually be moved to El-Wak? Well, El-Wak has been on the mind of President Madobe for probably a few months now. His allies in Nairobi also seem to support his proposition, having already prepared a venue in the city by the end of March 2022. However, the 17th September agreement clearly stipulates Gedo is the second election city for the Jubaland administration. This agreement became law once it was signed by both houses of parliament and the president by the end of 2022. Now, can one change this agreement in such a manner that is being done by feet? Well, the simple answer is no. For there to be a change in the agreement, the National Consultative Council must meet and agree on any changes. Therefore, technically, President Madobe and the Federal Election Implementation Team do not have the sole unilateral legal power to make such a huge decision. Nevertheless, the Jubaland State Election Implementation Team have released an election roadmap for El-Wak, with elections to take place between the 18th and the 27th of April, although it has not begun just yet. So if we look at it from a political sense then, because now we understand that in the legal sense, it wouldn't make any sense. Yet, the Jubaland state officials continue on with this. If we look at it from the political sense, what are the consequences? Well, it would be difficult to hold it because, see, the Gedo Regional Administration, led by Governor Ahmed Bola, has announced elections in Gedo. And this would mean that if both elections were to go ahead as planned, the region would have two sets of 16 MPs, which would only complicate the matter. As many of you guys are aware, Somalia has become a two-camp team. It's become either we support the President Farmaajo and his administration, or we're against it. And therefore, we obviously know how politics plays out in Somalia. It's very predictable, which is if there were two sets of elections, one side, the pro-Farmaajo administration side, would obviously support the election in Gedo, and the opposition side would obviously support the election in El-Wak, and therefore would have more things to fight about. Secondly, ultimately, it is difficult to see any positive outcome or resolution with elections happening in El-Wak. Firstly, the election would be open to manipulation by Kenyan officials and others that seek to influence the election in the region. Secondly, the Gedo Regional Authority would reject the outcome and elect its own MPs, and we just discussed obviously what could happen, the political chaos that could ensue as a result of this. And number three, tensions between Gedo and Kismayo would worsen. The relationship clearly is very, very bad at the moment, and for Jubaland to be a functioning and useful member of the federal government in any way or form, it must be able to unite as much as Puntland is to some degree, as much as Galmudug is to some degree, as much as Hirshabelle is. Jubaland seems to be the most disunited region in the federal government of Somalia, and therefore this would only make that situation worse. And number 4, the security risk is very high because Al-Shabaab is not very far away from the town and has threatened to attack. There have been continuous Al-Shabaab attacks at the Somali-Kenyan border, with many Kenyan police officers losing their lives, soldiers dying on the border region, because Al-Shabaab has a strong presence there, and therefore the security situation would be very, very difficult to do. Now let's move on to the other electoral impasse, which is seat 086. There was a hearing this afternoon which saw the legal team of Mr. Fadi Yassin challenge the federal election implementation team represented by the federal government. And the federal government argued that the Supreme Court didn't have the jurisdiction to rule on the case, citing various agreements, including the 17 September agreement, to posit that the final decision was left for the National Consultative Council rather than any other legal entity in Somalia. The government argued that the decision by the federal election implementation team was justified because the election of seat 086 didn't follow the correct procedure as stipulated under the 17 September agreement. FEET argued that the members of the clan elders, as well as some candidates, complained to the committee, and as a result, FEET has conveyed that the seat ought to be re-elected following the 2016 electoral framework. This is despite statements made by clan elders, Hirshabelle State Election Implementation Team, and even Hirshabelle Vice President Yusuf Dabaged that conveyed that the election was held fairly and within the correct procedure. Now, conversely, the team representing Mr. Yassin argued that FEET doesn't have the power to hold the election as the election happened in the correct procedure. It pointed to clan elders, the Hirshabelle seat, and the Hirshabelle government as evidence for the correct procedure, as well as footage of the election, among other things. Additionally, the team for Mr. Yassin argued that the government's Attorney General's office didn't have the constitutional power to decide on matters concerning the election. Now, the Supreme Court head Bashir Yusuf Ahmed has stated that the Supreme Court will reach a verdict on whether to continue this case. Now, despite all of this, Parliament yesterday had attempted to quickly hold the election of the Speaker and the President within a very, very short time frame. This could see seats in Gedo and Hirshabelle be completely bypassed, which would be a major hindrance and destruction of Somalia's election framework. And bearing in mind what happened in Southwest State, which saw 3 seats being held and eventually 2 being released, and after this only came after President Laftagaren made a wide and huge statement in which he accused FEET and Prime Minister Roble of using the FEET and legal framework to use for political gains. It's not surprising, therefore, that one could accuse FEET and the Prime Minister again of doing a similar thing in Hirshabelle with the seat concerning Mr. Fadi Yassin, and of course the election of the 16 seats in Gedo. But however, this is only accusations, and some analysts have made these accusations. When we assess Somalia's election framework, one realizes the utter uniqueness of the process, a process not replicated anywhere else in the globe. The indirect elections taking place in Somalia has been the longest elections in history and is based on a deeply unpopular 4.5 clan system. Now, Somalis didn't vote or choose this framework, however, it has been imposed upon them during a time when infighting and disunity seemed endless and a time where Somalis were weak. Under this system, every clan and region must be represented in all levels of governance on a federal level, from the Somali lower house, which elects the president, to the Somali cabinet. Now, if we were to hypothetically bypass Gedo, then there would not be MPs representing the clan and the people that live in the area to participate in the election of the president, which would lead to disenfranchisement of many. Somalia is at a vital crossroad during a vital election. Any decision and every decision made today, however reckless or however good it is, will be quite pivotal in shaping the country for the next 30 years. And we hope, and we really, really hope, that decisions being made by officials in Jubaland, in Gedo, in the federal government, in Hirshabelle, or whatever it could be, isn't the same disastrous decisions that took us 30 years to recover from.